Curtis A reached out to me, said make a theme song for my show. Said alright, just give me all the details, man. And my homie says he don't know. Well, if you're gonna pay me big bucks, cause I might should have something to say. He said, you know what I bring, I'm the customizing king, nothing else matters anyway. So is he gonna have guests? I don't know. Is he gonna go live? I don't know. What time will it be? What will you see? I'm pretty much in the dark, but I can guarantee he'll be customizing action figures, getting paint all on his fingers. It's art by Akerman. It's art by Akerman. Tips and tricks and conversation, sharing his gift with every nation. It's art by Akerman. Art by Akerman. You best get ready, cause now it's time for Art by Akerman.
Hello, I'm going to do a little video about wet palettes here, kind of what the benefits are. I bought a new one, so I'll be opening that one up in a second and getting it started, and I figured it'd be good to just kind of talk through that for anybody that's interested in getting into using one. So this here is a wet palette. Basically, it's a enclosed compartment that has a sponge and something to absorb the water through to try to keep your paints a little bit more fluid, keep their consistency longer. You will see, a lot of people using like regular paint palettes like this one. I use something like this. You can see for like a lot of metallics and things like that. Anything that could, either, that has like metal flakes in it that may go through the paper that I'm using onto the sponge or kind of ruin the sponge, I will still use a regular palette for. But for most of my work, I will use a wet palette like this. So this is one I've been using for a while now. I've actually just bought a new one to replace it. They do have replacement sponges for these, but over time, you can clean this as much as you want, and sometimes it just starts to get a little bit of a smell to it, or just gets to the point where it may be time to refresh it. So this one I think I've had for about a year and a half now, and it's just kind of time to replace. And they're very cheap. I think this one cost me like 14 bucks. This is Masterson's Stay Wet handy palette, and I got this off of Amazon. So you can see when I take the lid off, this is some stuff that I was working on last week. So you can see I kind of on this sponge, I've started to get kind of a hole over here. It's started to get a little bit of a stink to it. You can, rinse those sponges out just under hot water, kind of get some of that out of there. But over time, it just kind of builds up, and it's maybe time to replace it. And I think that's about where we're at now. So you can see just from looking at the paints, like I haven't used this in a week. But you still have, these paints have not dried out. Like if I just grab a brush here real quick, you can see like this blue here is still, very fluid. It's actually probably a little bit more fluid than I would want to use it right at this point. So I would probably add a little bit more actual paint to that. But it will keep your paints moist longer so that they don't dry out something like this, and then you can't use them at all. So at this point, we're going to get rid of this palette, and I'm going to bring in the new one, and we'll kind of go from there. So let's move this off to the side. And this is the new one here. This is the exact same one that we just looked at, but this is a newer one. So I'm going to open this up real quick. So you've got your little instruction thing on there. So you've got your palette, which is the same one that we just looked at, but this is the brand new one. And then when you open it up, you got a few things inside. You've got some of these papers, these wet palette papers. And the idea of these is that you're going to wet the sponge, and then the water is going to slowly seep up through the sponge, through these papers, and that's what's going to keep your paints cool and moist so that they don't dry out on you. So when you first get this sponge, it's going to be it's going to look like it's longer than what it needs to for the box. And it's going to be kind of awkward. But as soon as you wet this is going to take the form that you need and kind of fill up that area. So when I go and do this, I actually use bottled water. I don't use tap water just because, you know, the bottled water will have a little bit more filtration and you're not getting as much like impurities and different things in there that could cause, you know, some of those mildewy and molding type problems. So I'm just going to kind of wet this sponge here all over. And if I get too much on there, I could always pour some out. And then just kind of watch it kind of take shape in that box. And what I'm looking for in here when I'm wetting this sponge, I don't want standing water. So when I hold it off to the side, I don't want it building up like that. You can see it kind of building up in the corner there. So I don't want too much of that. So I'm actually going to pour some of this out real quick. But I want enough that it's going to stay wet. So at this point, I'm holding it over to the side and I can just see a little bit kind of building up there. It took a while though. So that's pretty good for my taste. So I feel like that's pretty moist at this point. We should be good with that. Sorry if anybody doesn't like that word. I know that's kind of a sensitive word for some people. And then these are the papers that it comes with. Now, I will say I do not use these papers. I know a lot of people that use a wet palette do, and you can buy replacement papers of these. I feel like these don't absorb the amount of moisture that I want. It takes a little bit longer for me. I like to keep my paints a little bit thinner. So instead of these, I will use just actual parchment paper. So like you see here, this is the Reynolds kitchen parchment paper. It's the one that has the, it's got lines on it, which makes it easier to cut to the right shape. And then what I do is I just cut a bunch of them. So you can see these are already cut. And I cut them into, you know, shapes that the rectangles for this wet palette, so it'll fit. So after I've wet my sponge, I just put this down. And when you do this, it's going to curl up. So just kind of let it do its thing. It's going to curl up on you. Spread it back out. And then what I will do is flip it. So I'm going to flip it, put it on this side, which will get some of that curl out of it. And then I usually use my X-Acto knife and kind of as a roller to get the air out of it. Just really wet that parchment paper. And then I'll flip it one more time back to the original side that we used. And do the same thing again. I'm just trying to get all the air bubbles out of it there. And then once I've done that, then I usually just kind of grab some tissue paper and get the standing water on here. So this is just, you know, from a Kleenex box, and just get the standing water off of there. And at this point, I'm ready to use my wet palette. So, you know, what I'll do with this when I'm using my paints, I'm actually going to do some skin tones here in a bit. So I'll start with this. This is Citadel Kislev Flesh. That's usually kind of my starting point for a Caucasian flesh tone. And then I'll kind of add some yellow, red, maybe even some brown to it to get to the shade that I'm looking for. So the way that I use a wet palette is I'll put the paint directly on the palette. And then a couple different ways of doing this. One is to get a dropper. So I got a dropper like this that you can actually just kind of add some water to it. And then you can kind of put in just a few drops. Or typically what I'll do is I'll just, as long as my cup of water that I'm using for my brushes is fairly clean still, I will just throw a couple drops of water on the palette from there. And then I'll use that to mix the paint to the consistency that I'm looking for. And typically, you know, it depends on what I'm doing. Typically, I'm looking for like the consistency of milk on this, but depending on, you know, if you're doing later layers on the skin or something, you may want it thinner, almost like a wash. So depending on how thin you want it or how thick you want it, whether you're doing a base or a layer or a wash, you can adjust the thickness of this to get it to the level that you want it to be. And then the good thing about the wet palette is that it's then going to stay that consistency while you use it. Now, you know, you could leave it overnight, come back the next day, it's probably still going to be pretty good. If it's soaked in too much water, it may be a little bit liquidy, kind of like what we saw at the beginning with the old palette. But, you know, as long as you're not leaving it sit for a week at a time or multiple weeks at a time, like, you're still going to be able to use this paint. So if let's say I'm working with this paint and I get it to the consistency I want, and then I have to step away for an hour and I come back, it's not going to dry out like it would on that regular palette that we showed at first. So it's not going to dry out like this, and you're going to still be able to use that paint. So I hope this helps somebody. If you have any questions or comments, please, you know, drop it in the comment section. I'll try to answer any that I can and kind of go from there. But like I said, I hope that helped, and thanks for watching.
Tips and tricks and conversation, sharing his gift with every nation. It's Art by Akerman, Art by Akerman. You best get ready, cause now it's time for Art by Akerman.